Capitol Hill testifying about the economic outlook. This Joint Economic Committee hearing is about an hour and 50 minutes.
I'm pleased to welcome Chairman Greenspan before the committee once again to testify on the economic outlook. We appreciate the many times that you have testified before this committee, Mr. Chairman, and recognize your outstanding stewardship of monetary policy during your tenure as Fed Chairman. You have guided monetary policy through stock market crashes, wars, terrorist attacks, and natural disasters with a steady hand. The American people appreciate that. Under your tenure, price stability has been the norm, with inflation low and stable. You have made a great contribution to the prosperity of the U.S., and the nation is in your debt. A broad array of standard economic data reflects the health of the U.S. economy. Figures released last week indicate that the economy grew at a 3.8% rate last quarter, despite the massive regional destruction wrought by the hurricanes. So far, during 2005, the economy has expanded at a 3.6% rate, roughly in line with Federal Reserve expectations as well as blue chip indicators. Equipment and software investment has bolstered the economy since 2003 and continues at a healthy pace. This component of investment responded especially sharply to the incentives contained in the 2003 tax package. Employment has also gained over the period, with 4.2 million jobs added to the business payrolls since May of 2003, and the unemployment rate is at 5.1%. Consumer spending continues to grow. Home ownership has reached record highs. Household net worth is also at a record level. Productivity continues at a healthy pace. And although higher energy prices have raised business costs and imposed hardships on many consumers, these prices have not derailed the expansion. As the Fed recently suggested, long-term inflation pressures are contained. As a result, long-term interest rates, such as mortgage rates, are still relatively low. By its action, the Fed has made clear its determination to keep inflation in check. In summary, the economy has displayed impressive flexibility and resilience in absorbing many shocks. Monetary policy and tax incentives for investment have made important contributions in accelerating the expansion in recent years. The most recent release of Fed minutes indicates that the central bank expects this economic growth to continue through 2006. The blue chip consensus of private economic forecasters also suggests that the economy will grow in excess of 3% next year. Current economic conditions are positive, and the outlook for 2006 is favorable. Let me just say at this time, before I turn to Ms. Maloney for her opening statement, that unfortunately, I understand the senators have been detained by a series of 16 or 17 votes. And so whether they'll be able to make it here during the course of the morning is uncertain, but certainly we hope they do. And I also would note that the Ways and Means Committee, of which many of our majority members are members of that committee, is also in the process of some kind of a important meeting. So we'll just have to wait and see what we see in terms of attendance. But in the meantime, Ms. Maloney, we're ready for your opening statement.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And on that note, I'd like to place into the record Senator Reid's opening statement and hope that everyone will get a chance to see it. It's over on the desk. First of all, I want to welcome Chairman Greenspan for his appearance before the Joint Economic Committee as Fed Chairman. And this will probably be your last appearance before us. And first of all, I want to say that New York is so proud of you. And we take tremendous pride in the fact that you are a born, tried, and true New Yorker. And many of my constituents have expressed their gratitude for your service and their hope that in retirement you'll be able to spend more time back in New York City. You have really done great service for this nation. You've pulled us through some difficult times that were outlined by the chairman. I'd like to add to that list 9/11. That was a very difficult economic time, and your leadership is greatly appreciated by New York and the entire nation. Over the past 18 years, Chairman Greenspan has achieved a really remarkable record of success as the country's central banker. He has steadfastly maintained the Fed's credibility for keeping inflation under control while dealing flexibly with a variety of economic challenges. The 10-year economic expansion of the 1990s was the longest on record. One contributing factor was Chairman Greenspan's strong sense in the middle of that expansion that there was room for monetary policy to accommodate further reductions in the unemployment rate, even though the conventional wisdom at the time said otherwise. Of course, another contributing factor was the Clinton administration's strong commitment to deficit reduction, which created a fiscal policy environment conducive to strong, sustainable, non-inflationary growth. Unfortunately, that discipline is now a distant memory, and Chairman Greenspan's successor will face a host of problems managing monetary policy in the face of historically large budget deficits, the largest in history, a record current account deficit, a negative household savings rate, rising inflation, and a labor market recovery that remains very weak in many respects. As always, I look very much forward to hearing Chairman Greenspan's testimony. I hope that in addition to his views on the economic outlook, he will share with us some reflections on what has made his tenure at the Fed so successful and what are the key lessons he would want to pass on to his successor. We thank you for your many years of public service.
Mr. Chairman, let me just add my personal thanks for you being here today, and just say that in my office there's a great picture of you with me, and as my constituents come in and tell me whatever it is that's on their mind on the way out the door, I often point to that picture and say, and there we are planning for this great economy. And so it's been a pleasure working with you, sir, and Mr. Chairman, we are ready for your statement.
First, let me thank you both. It's very thoughtful and kind. I will be excerpting from my prepared remarks and request a full transcript be included for the record.
Without objection. Thank you.
Prior to the hurricanes that severely damaged the Gulf Coast, the economy appeared to have considerable momentum, but pressures on inflation remained elevated. Then Hurricane Katrina hit at the end of August, causing widespread disruptions to oil and natural gas production and driving the price of light sweet crude oil above $70 per barrel. With the recovery from the first storm barely underway, Hurricane Rita hit, causing additional destruction, especially to the energy production and distribution systems in the Gulf. These events are likely to exert a drag on employment and production in the near term and to add to the upward pressure on the general price level. But the prices of crude oil and refined petroleum products have now fallen significantly from their peaks, and repair and rebuilding activity is underway in many parts of the affected region. Outside the areas affected by the storms, economic fundamentals remain firm, and the U.S. economy appears to have retained considerable forward momentum. If allowance is taken for the effects of Katrina and Rita, and for the now settled machinist strike at Boeing, industrial production rose at an annual rate of 5.25% in the third quarter. That's up from an annual rate of 1.25% in the second quarter, with a marked slowing of inventory accumulation. I should say, when a marked slowing of inventory accumulation was a restraining influence on growth. The September employment report showed a loss of 35,000 jobs. However, an upward revision to payroll gains over the summer indicated a stronger underlying pace of hiring before the storms than had been previously estimated. The Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates that employment growth in areas not affected by the storms was in line with the average pace over the 12 months ending in August. Retail spending eased off in September, likely reflecting the effects of the hurricanes and higher gasoline prices. Major chain stores report a gradual recovery over October in the pace of spending, though light motor vehicle sales declined sharply last month when some major incentives to purchase expired. The longer-term prospects for the United States economy remain favorable. Structural productivity continues to grow at a firm pace, and rebuilding activity following the hurricanes should boost real GDP growth for a while. More uncertainty, however, surrounds the outlook for inflation. The past decade of low inflation and solid economic growth in the United States and in many other countries around the world has been without precedent in recent decades. Much of that favorable performance is attributable to the remarkable confluence of innovations that spawned new computer, telecommunication, and networking technologies, which, especially in the United States, have elevated the growth of productivity, suppressed unit labor costs, and helped to contain inflationary pressures. The result has been a virtuous cycle of low prices and solid growth. Contributing to the disinflationary pressures that have been evident in the global economy over the past decade or more has been the integration of in excess of 100 million educated workers from the former Soviet bloc into the world's open trading system. More recently, and of even greater significance, has been the freeing from central planning of large segments of China's 750 million workforce. The gradual addition of these workers, plus workers from India, a country which is also currently undergoing a notable increase in its participation in the world trading system, would approximately double the overall supply of labor once all these workers become fully engaged in competitive world markets. Of course, at current rates of productivity, the half of the world's labor force that has been newly added to the world competitive marketplace is producing no more than 1/4 of world output. With increased education and increased absorption of significant cutting-edge technologies, that share will surely rise. Over the past decade or more, the gradual assimilation of these new entrants into the world's free market trading system has restrained the rise of unit labor costs in much of the world and hence has helped to contain inflation. As this process has unfolded, inflation expectations have decreased, and accordingly the inflation premiums embodied in long-term interest rates around the world have come down. The effective augmentation of world supply and the accompanying disinflationary pressures have made it easier for the Federal Reserve and other central banks to achieve price stability in an environment of generally solid economic growth. But this seminal shift in the world's workforce is producing, in effect, a level adjustment in unit labor costs. To be sure, economic systems evolve from centrally planned to market-based only gradually and at times in fits and starts. Thus, this level adjustment is being spread over an extended period. Nevertheless, the suppression of cost growth and world inflation at some point will begin to abate, and with the completion of this level adjustment, gradually end. These global forces pressing inflation and interest rates lower may well persist for some time. Nonetheless, it is the rate at which countries are integrated into the global economic system, not the extent of their integration, that governs the degree to which the rise in world unit labor costs will continue to be subdued. Where the global economy is currently in this dynamic, where the global economy is currently in this dynamic process remains open to question. But going forward, these trends will need to be monitored carefully by the world's central banks. Mr. Chairman, I want to conclude with a few remarks about the federal budget situation, which, at least until Hurricanes Katrina and Rita struck the Gulf Coast, was showing signs of modest improvement. Indeed, tax receipts have exhibited considerable strength of late, posting an increase of nearly 15% in fiscal 2005 as a result of sizable gains in individual and even more corporate income taxes. Thus, although spending continued to rise gradually last year, the deficit in the unified budget dropped to $319 billion, nearly $100 billion less than the figure for fiscal year 2004, and a much smaller figure than many had anticipated earlier in the year. Lowering the deficit further in the near term, however, will be difficult in light of the need to pay for post-hurricane reconstruction and relief. But even apart from the hurricanes, our budget position is unlikely to improve substantially further until we restore constraints similar to the Budget Enforcement Act of 1990, which were allowed to lapse in 2002. Even so, the restoration of pay-go and discretionary caps will not address the far more difficult choices that confront the Congress as the baby boom generation edges towards retirement. As I have testified on numerous occasions, current entitlement law may have already promised to this next generation of retirees more in real resources than our economy, with its predictably slowing rate of labor force growth, will be able to supply. So long as health care costs continue to grow faster than the economy as a whole, as seems likely, federal spending on health and retirement programs would rise at a rate that risks placing the budget on an unsustainable trajectory. Specifically, large deficits will result in rising interest rates and an ever-growing ratio of debt service to GDP. Unless the situation is reversed, at some point these budget trends will cause serious economic disruptions. We owe it to those who will retire over the next couple of decades to promise only what the government can deliver. The present policy path makes current promises, at least in real terms, highly conjectural. If fewer resources will be available per retiree than promised under current law, those in their later working years need sufficient time to adjust their work and retirement decisions. Crafting a budget strategy that meets the nation's longer-run needs will become ever more difficult and costly the more we delay. The one certainty is that the resolution of the nation's demographic challenge will require hard choices, and that the future performance of the economy will depend on those choices. No changes will be easy, as they all will involve setting priorities and making trade-offs among valued alternatives. The Congress must determine how best to address the competing claims on our limited resources. In doing so, you will need to consider not only the distributional effects of policy changes, but also the broader economic effects on labor supply, retirement behavior, and private savings. The benefits of taking sound, timely action could extend many decades into the future. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and the concluding thoughts that you had, I believe, are very important as well, and I'm hopeful that we all do. Mr. Chairman, let me refer first in a question to something that you mentioned in your testimony, and that is expectations related to inflation. I'd like to show you, I'd like to put up a chart, if I may, that shows, this is based on the core personal consumption expenditures, which is a measure of inflation that the Fed likes to use. In some ways, it's similar to the CPI. The Fed has successfully kept this measure of inflation in a range between 1% and 2%, which some refer to as the Fed's comfort zone. By keeping inflation low and in this narrow range, it seems to me that the Fed has reduced and helped keep long-term interest rates lower than they would otherwise be. We know that we have had 12 short-term increases in interest rates brought about by monetary policy. And at the same time, long-term rates, which oftentimes in the past have tracked along with short-term rates, have remained relatively low. By lowering uncertainty, by keeping inflation controlled, and reducing the inflation premium embedded in interest rates, it seems to me that price stability has helped promote long-term economic growth, and in doing so, kept interest rates relatively, long-term interest rates relatively low. Is this a policy that was planned by the Fed, and what is your perception of how it's worked?
Well, I'd go back to the earlier years of when I first joined the Federal Reserve. Our general policy that emerged from there, from that particular period going forward, was a recognition of our dual mandate to maintain maximum sustainable growth and price stability. What we began to learn, especially economists observing the 1970s, which came as I should say, a conceptual shock to most economists, because they didn't believe you could get both rising unemployment and rising inflation concurrently. We began to recognize that indeed rising inflation causes unemployment, or the reverse, that a necessary condition for maximum sustainable growth is indeed price stability. So what has occurred over the years is a recognition that rather having a dual set of goals which are independent of one another, which indeed was the general policy prescription in earlier decades, we've recognized that really it is price stability which creates economic growth, employment, and higher standards of living. We have chosen the core PCE inflation measure as our standard gauge largely because, as I've argued many times in the past, there are structural problems in the consumer's price index which doesn't capture the inflation rate per se. We're also aware that even though this is a superior measure to the CPI, it nonetheless does have upward measurement bias. And it ranges, depending on how you look at some of the numbers, from 0.5% as much as a percentage point. Secondarily, as you may recall, when we ran into what looked to be the beginnings of at least a possible disinflationary set of pressures in the summer of 2003, another surprise to economists who did not believe that that would be feasible in a world of fiat money, but Japan proved otherwise. We gained from that experience a recognition that we don't want to get close to that particular area either. So we have chosen effectively to perceive a price stability largely as the range which you are seeing after making adjustments for the statistical and economic adjustments which we learned over the last couple of decades. I don't want to communicate to you that somehow we had this chart up there and every time the inflation rate got close to the top, we tightened, and every time it got down to the bottom, we eased. That's not the way policy is run because there are long leads and various different things. But essentially, as I indicated fairly early on in this particular period, I commented I thought that we had in fact achieved price stability. And while it's moved up and down since then, it's broadly stayed in that range. And judging from the data which you cited, Mr. Chairman, it appears to be a range which is really quite conducive to economic growth and the prosperities that are associated with that.
Let me ask a question that's related to inflation as it also relates to energy. Oil prices in particular have shot up, as every American consumer knows, boosting increases in the major broad price indices. Arguably, however, the additional expense of oil might not be inflationary if it were offset by cutting back on other expenses. In the absence of an accommodative monetary policy, should oil prices necessarily be expected to lead to increases in inflation? And I think this is an important set of issues that we deal with, particularly with regard to energy prices. Would you give us your response to that?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think there are two aspects to this. One is a technical issue which relates to the degree to which American business, confronted with increasing energy costs, institutes various different actions, either by capital equipment or changing of the structure by which goods are produced. The extent to which they do that, they can increase the efficiency of oil use, and indeed we've been seeing that for several decades. The ratio of British thermal units per constant dollar of GDP has effectively been falling progressively decade after decade since the 1970s in this country, so that the intensity of energy use, and indeed oil use as well, is about half of what it was relative to the level of GDP, say, 30 years ago. The increasing, if I may put it in these terms, productivity of energy, gains in productivity associated with more efficient use of energy continues to this day. Indeed, as best we can judge, the very sharp increase in prices and therefore costs to the non-financial, non-energy corporations of this country actually induced a fairly significant rise in efficiency, so it all didn't pass through as cost increases. But more important is the perception that inflation overall will be contained. Indeed, as you point out, inflation expectations is a crucial variable in any market system, largely because it tends to be a key factor in wage rates and labor costs generally. And so long as the Federal Reserve is perceived to be holding inflation expectations in check, which means holding core inflation in check, the pass-through of energy costs into the underlying inflation rate will be subdued. And indeed, the data indicate that while prior to the early 1980s, a goodly part of energy costs were indeed passed through into the general price level, subsequent to then, there's very little indication that indeed has been the case, and we associate it with the significant decline in inflation expectations. And one of the reasons why we are very firm in the notion that this country should not visit the 1970s again in way of inflation is, in fact, we've managed to keep expectations to a point where, as difficult as energy problems are, and there is no doubt there's been a very significant amount of hardship, especially with the rise in gasoline prices, and I think people are going to be quite surprised at their heating bills this winter. Aside from that, we've not had the pass-through into other products in a manner which existed in the 1970s.
Let me ask you just one final question, and then we'll go to Ms. Maloney. According to the FOMC statement of last Tuesday, quote, core inflation has been relatively low in recent months and longer-term inflation expectations remain contained, end quote. Given the need for the Fed to preempt inflation, to what extent is the Fed now addressing inflationary expectations or fears that may not be fully evident in the current available data?
Inflationary expectations are reasonably well measured concurrently and in real time, in the sense that we pick it up from a variety of different sources, but mostly from the structure of interest rates, very specifically the differences between interest rates which are defined in real terms, such as the TIPS, Treasury TIPS issue, and what we call compensation, additional compensation required for inflation. That pretty much picks up what we're looking at. And although we measure the same phenomena in a number of different ways, in other words, we have a whole series of measures which relate to inflation expectation measured in different ways, but essentially picking up the same general attitude that's embodied in the marketplace. And they all pretty much show very much the same sort of pattern, which is namely that, as we said, they are contained.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're going to move now to Ms. Maloney for her questions.
Thank you, Chairman Greenspan. The question that my constituents ask me, I'm going to ask you. If the economy is so good and inflation is so well behaved and there's price stability, then why does everything cost so much more when you go to buy something? They're feeling pressured in their lives. And the question that I hear from my neighbors and friends and constituents is when we have so many economic indicators that are unhealthy, how are we having a healthy economy? We have a costly war, the largest deficit in history, the largest trade deficit in history, high energy costs, a weak dollar, huge investment from foreign countries. All of these patterns are very troubling to people, yet the economy appears, according to your testimony, strong and moving forward. And they question, how can it be strong when there is so many concrete problems out there that are unhealthy for the economy? And I'd like to frame the question in terms of your career at the Fed. When you first came in the 70s, your first job was with President Ford as the head of his Council of Economic Advisors. And when you took that job, the country was going through a great deal of what we're going through now, probably less shock than we have now. You had the high energy price shock, but not the huge deficits in history, and you didn't have a war. But inflation in '74 shot up to double-digit territory, and that by '75 the economy was in a serious recession, with the unemployment rate rising from under 6% in '74 to 8.5% in '75. And now we are experiencing yet another energy price shock. But your testimony is very optimistic, and you are saying that we will not see any serious inflation, and we will not see a recession. You're very optimistic. And I want to know, how are you confident that we will not, that we will be able to avoid the same type of economic outcomes now that we had in the 70s? Has the economy fundamentally changed? Are we more competitive? Is it the world economy? Is it Fed policy? What has changed so that the economy has not experienced the really dramatic problems that we had in the 70s? And I guess that part of it is, what are the key changes over the past 30 years in our economy and in the way that we are conducting monetary policy that have put us in a better position to withstand energy supply shocks or price shocks?
Well, Congresswoman, that is a very important question, because it's the experience that we had in the 1970s that gave us a far better understanding of how the post-World War II American economy functions. First, let me say that we have a very complex, a huge economy which is churning. There are winners and there are losers, and there are pockets in the economy which are where things are exceptionally weak, areas where they're strong. The best way of maybe summarizing why I say things are doing well is that I would suspect that on average I worry about 20 different problems which seem insurmountable out there. Today there are only 12 or thereabouts. So they're still out there, and as you know, I have mentioned on innumerable occasions, despite the fact that the economy overall is growing, there is a definite bimodal labor market in the sense that the 80% of the labor force, which are production workers, wages are growing far less quickly than the skilled workers. And this, as I have mentioned before you in numerous occasions, I think is essentially an educational problem which we need, and it's in fact mandated to adjust because it's creating a skewing of income distribution in this country, which I think is a very unsettling trend for democracy. That to me is where I think the major problems are. But what I should also point out that the reason people are think they're seeing prices rising is they are. They're seeing them, however, for a lot of petroleum-related products. The one statistic that I think almost everybody is able to audit clearly every day, every week, is the price of gasoline, because it's a homogeneous product and it's listed up there on the signs and the service stations all the time. And that, needless to say, has been fluctuating all over the place. But the Bureau of Labor Statistics does an excellent job in trying to truly get what is the structure of price change in this country. And those data, which essentially come from the BLS in the detail, are as best as we can do. So I think that it's mainly a selective view, which is, when you look at the total, is what people often see in a period like this, but when you look at all of the data, it doesn't show the concern of acceleration that I often hear as you do. What has changed since the 1970s with respect to oil is, as I mentioned before, we are using only half as much as we used to relative to the GDP in the 1970s. And as a consequence of that, and also because of the fact that the underlying inflation rate is now much lower, we are able to absorb a remarkable amount of what, as I mentioned the last time I was before the JEC, which amounted to a tax on the American consumer. We've been able to absorb that to a large extent because I think we have an extraordinarily more flexible economy than we had back in the mid-70s. And indeed, that very flexibility itself is one of the reasons we have gotten through a whole series of shocks that the chairman mentioned early on. And it's the development of that flexibility coupled with the fact that the use of energy is much less than it was, has enabled us to absorb the energy shock with nowhere near the type of consequences that we confronted in the earlier period.
Thank you. In your testimony today, Chairman Greenspan, you stress the long-term budget pressures that we face with the retiring baby boomers, and we have very little flexibility in our budget. Most of it is entitlements. We have very little discretionary spending now in our federal budget. So this is a huge challenge. But weren't those pressures also there in 2001? And wouldn't it have been better if we had focused on that challenge in 2001 instead of enacting tax cuts that lost revenue and reduced our national saving? And I want to read the following quote from a story that was in the New York Times on Monday, and I quote, "Mr. Greenspan is widely perceived as having given a green light to President Bush's plans for a big tax cut in 2001, and thus to have helped set the stage for the huge deficits that followed," end quote. And do you have any regrets about the way you expressed yourself in 2001, and were you surprised that your testimony was interpreted as having given a green light of support for these policies that have added to this extremely large budget deficit?
Let me review what was going on then and what I actually testified to with respect to the budget at that particular point. We, as you know, had very large surpluses which all of the technical people said that were we to project them further, and indeed the Congressional Budget Office projected them further, Office of Management and Budget projected them further, the staff at the Federal Reserve projected them further, we all trying to get as full detailed an analysis as we could on something which we found very surprising, namely chronic surpluses, which we never believed we would ever see. We could not find technical reasons to say that those data were incorrect. Indeed, the Federal Reserve embarked upon a policy of what we would do with respect to open market policy when is that then appeared the actual supply of U.S. Treasury issues would become inadequate for purposes of open market action, meaning that the budget, the level of debt outstanding would approach de minimis levels. The problem that you have, if you get to that point and you still have surpluses, is that you have to accumulate essentially private assets, or technically private assets plus state and local assets. And I have always argued that that is a very potentially destabilizing system where you have very large assets, claims on American business, which is where a lot of that would be, held by the U.S. government. As a consequence, I argued at that time that we ought to bring taxes, we ought to cut taxes before we ran into the point where the debt would get to such levels that we couldn't reduce it anymore and would therefore have to accumulate assets. Were I confronted with the same data today as I was confronted with back then, I would have given exactly the same testimony. I must tell you, however, that in that whole evaluation, I did recognize in the testimony that even though we couldn't find anything wrong with the forecasts of surpluses, that should they in fact dissipate, we ought to have procedures which would follow up on any changes in budgetary policies, whether tax cuts or expenditure increases, and essentially have triggers or other means of review that would reverse the actions that would be taken at that particular point in time. So I've gone back and I've reviewed that testimony, and I must tell you that aside from the fact that the probability that we all perceived of the deficit reemerging was small, and that was clearly a forecast gone wrong. Or not that the probability was small, but that we would maintain the surpluses. Aside from that, I must say I would have reproduced this testimony word for word.
Well, former Treasury Secretary O'Neill reports that when he expressed concern about the possible impact of the proposed tax cuts on the deficit, and he said that Vice President Cheney said, and quote, "Reagan proved that deficits don't matter." And did you have any idea when you gave that testimony that in 2001 that the administration had was not serious about containing deficits, was not serious about enforcement rules to help turn record deficits into surpluses and to control the budget? I mean,
I think the deficits don't matter issue referred to that they don't impact on interest rates. And I disagreed with that. I disagreed with it then, I disagreed with it now, and I disagree with it because the facts prove otherwise.
my time is up, and as always, it's a great pleasure to listen and learn from you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Maloney. Mr. Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Greenspan. Looking at your last three paragraphs, I certainly would agree with your concern about the future financing of the medical care system, as well as the retirement programs, and as well as financing the debt. And to me, I read that as a rather dire warning of what we should be dealing with in the Congress, and you make a suggestion that the entitlement laws should be looked at because we cannot sustain this. And yet I think that's only part of the problem, because the entitlement system is certainly one reason why we spend a lot of money. I don't think we can do this without addressing the subject of what we do with our foreign policy as we spend hundreds of billions of dollars overseas destroying countries and then rebuilding countries. I cannot see how we can adjust our ways here unless we think about that as well. But I also think that we should tie in this deficit spending and this commitment to the future to overall monetary policy, because I think the system of money that we have had helped create the problems that we have. And we can't separate the two, because it certainly makes it a lot easier for Congress to spend if there's some way of creating new money to accommodate these deficits. Just in the time that you've been at the Fed, we've had a lot of monetary inflation. We've had a lot of new money pumped into the system. Matter of fact, it's over $600 trillion as measured by M3. It's all new money. That's 3 times as much money as we had in '87. But interestingly enough, the total debt, government debt, corporate debt, and personal debt has done the same thing. It's tripled. It was approximately $8 trillion in '87. Now it's like $25 trillion. So a lot of new money was created, and we have a lot of new debt in the system, but we also suffered a consequence. Our dollar now is worth 55 cents. So that to me seems unfair, because if I'd have saved money in '87, I'm only going to get 55 cents back on my dollar. There's something, I think there's a moral element to this too, as well as an economic argument. Why save? And we don't save. If we need more money to take care of our entitlements or fight a war or accommodate the debt, we just literally are able to go and depend on the Federal Reserve to make sure interest rates don't go up. And then I think another problem we have is that we look at the wrong things when we're looking at our problems. It's been said that the government tells us there's really no inflation, but you know, we could use what we strike out. We could look at medical care costs, we could look at food, we could look at energy, we could look at the cost of government taxes, and who knows, the inflation rate might be 12% or 14%. So sometimes I think we deceive ourselves with the system of money that we have today by looking at the wrong things. Because of globalization and productivity, prices have, in some respect, been held in check. But I cannot see how we can continuously reassure ourselves that that is good, because it doesn't deal with the problem of the malinvestment, the overinvestment, the bubbles that develop, and as well as the debt that builds up. And this could not be done other than with someone being able to create credit out of thin air. I think it would be held in check. So in order to get this into a question, isn't there something unfair about this system? How can we justify stealing value from people who save, cheat the people who are on retirement and they get so little on their interest earned, as well as, is this a wise thing to do economically? Because you have expressed the concerns that I have, but I cannot see how you can separate that from the overall monetary system that we've been dealing with a lot longer than you've been in charge of the Fed.
Well, Congressman, I think the first thing that we have to recognize is that the inflation rate, properly measured at this particular stage, has been very close to zero for a very long period of time. In other words, as I said earlier, those numbers are biased upwards because of the way we calculate it. So while it is true that a number of the statistics you quote, those statistics go back well before the inflation rate stabilized and are reflecting very substantial inflation pressures which existed, especially during the 1970s when inflation rate was double-digit. But the level of nominal GDP has gone up basically roughly the same after certain types of adjustments with what the real underlying GDP properly measured would have done. And that tells me that we are not unduly inflating the system.
Well,
We're not.
I don't think that reconciles the facts that I can get from the Federal Reserve that shows that our dollar is worth 55 cents compared to 1987. If that's not the reverse of what you see on rising price and inflation, my dollar just doesn't buy as much anymore, and the trend is continuous. Since 1914, it's worth 5 cents. So I don't see how you can say there's no inflation.
Well, you and I have discussed this issue at length many times over the years, and I agree with you in part, and I disagree with you in the other part.
Can you say anything favorably about gold?
I'm sorry?
Can you say anything favorable about gold today?
The gentleman's time, the gentleman's time has expired, and we're going to go now to Mr. Hinchey.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Greenspan, I just want to say that we are going to miss you, really miss you. I think that you've probably been one of the most effective chairmen of the board in the history of the Federal Reserve.
Thank you.
And also, I think, one of the most interesting and instructive. And I think that that instruction has come on a variety of levels. So you've done one heck of a job. I won't say brownie, but you've done one heck of a job. And I think we're going to miss you a great deal. And I want to thank you, take this opportunity to thank you very much for your service. And to share the things that were said by my friend and colleague, Mrs. Maloney, a few moments ago. As a New Yorker, I'm very proud of you, too. The economic circumstances that we're experiencing today, growth in the economy, is a result of a variety of things, not the least of which, the most of which, frankly, I think, is the conflux of some extraordinary circumstances of economic stimulation. We've had record low interest rates, extraordinary amounts of federal spending, and record tax cuts, all coming at the same time. And if you don't have economic stimulation and a growing economy, when you're pouring all that money in, both in terms of monetary and fiscal policy, then you're in deep, deep trouble. So I'm, frankly, very concerned about what's going to happen when this conflux of circumstances kind of wears out, and it certainly will in the not-too-distant future. So that would be my first question to you. What's going to happen when all of this stimulation starts to decline?
Congressman, it depends on what is going on in the world generally, because you can remove all of that stimulation, but if the underlying incentives of the private system are increasing, as I think they are at the moment, especially coming out of the hurricanes, you can more than offset stimulation, if you want to put it that way, from the private sector.
Well, that's true, and if that happens, that may be the case.
Well, you know, the history of stimulating a market economy is mixed. There are innumerable occasions in the past when we've engaged in very significant stimulation in that respect. In other words, large deficits, large expansions of the monetary base, and we found that real GDP barely grew, indeed often fell into recession because of the inflation which was engendered by the excess stimulus. So I think we have to be careful about defining what type of stimulus, what part of the economy it's imposed on or injected into, and what's going on mainly in the private sector, because that's where most of the job generation occurs.
Well, the
And
job
I'm not,
generation
I'll
in
just,
the private
let me
sector-
just finalize. I recognize that. I agree with you. I think that it's going to be significant pulling back in the overall degree of stimulus. At least I hope there is, because if we engage in the fiscal policy that I was concerned about is in play in the latter part of my testimony, then we're going to get exceptionally large amount of fiscal stimulus, which we're not going to want.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I know that's a very vague and ambiguous answer, and it's probably the best you can do in the context. But the fact of the matter is that I think we're going to be facing some very serious problems when we begin to pull back, and we will have to pull back. In terms of the job production in the private sector, I mean, this economy has lost substantially more than 1 million jobs, manufacturing jobs, in the last 5 years, and those are the best-paying jobs. One of the scholars at the American Enterprise Institute very recently made the observation that the benefits in the economy, and these are his words, the benefits in the economy are not filtering down, that the economic benefits are going to capital and not to workers. And we see that very, very clearly. The median pre-tax income is now $44,389. That's the lowest it's been since 1997. We have a situation here in our country where the median income of the average American family has been flat for 5 years. The biggest problem that we're going to face, in addition to maintaining the growth of the economy, assuming that we can do that, even as we have to withdraw all of this stimulation that we've been pouring into it because of growing budget deficits and a national debt now that exceeds $8 trillion. The biggest problem that we're going to face is how to engage in some more equitable distribution of the benefits of the economic growth in the context of a democratic society. How are we going to do that?
Well, first of all, let me just say that there's a question about what the real median income level has been, and it gets to different types of price deflation and different types of definition of which data are being employed.
Well, that,
but
number,
the major issue,
that number takes into consideration inflation.
Yeah, no, I'm not, but I just want to basically, I don't disagree with your the conclusion that you raised as a consequence of that. The issue basically is most vividly reflected in the fact that in the last period, the 20% of the workforce, which is largely supervisory by definition, has had hourly wage increases approaching 10%, whereas those in the 80% who are perceived to be production workers is under 4. And what that is doing is essentially creating a type of, as I mentioned before, bimodal distribution. The argument that seems most convincing to me as to the cause of this problem, indeed it's almost necessary, we have clearly observed a major increase in the need for skilled workers to basically staff our ever increasingly complex technological capital stock. On the other hand, we've seen a relative decrease in those who are required to do less skilled work. Our educational system, however, has, as best we can judge, been falling short in pushing our students, one, from 4th grade through high school and from high school into the universities at too slow a pace relative to the rest of the world. And as a consequence of that, we are left with a shortage of skilled workers that would go through this whole educational process, and we're left with a lot of more lesser skilled people than we need to staff our capital structure, with the result that wages are rising inordinately rapidly amongst the skilled and at a very subdued level in the lesser skilled, and this is creating a very marked change in the distribution of income. And it is true that it is showing up in the capital as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hinchey.
I wish we had more opportunity to follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I'm sorry. I agree with you. I think this is a very important question for the United States.
Yeah. We're going to, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Hinchey. We're going to go to the gentleman from northwestern Pennsylvania, member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. English.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Greenspan, let me first say I would also like to thank you for your long years of testimony before this and other committees up here on the Hill, and your willingness to speak truth to power and present some powerful economic realities to us, whether they are politically comfortable at the moment or not. I'm particularly grateful in this testimony that you have focused on the nuances of the problems that you see in our fiscal policy, and particularly the fact that we have an ongoing challenge in dealing with the deficit. I was particularly grateful for how your testimony also focused on the fact that prior to Katrina, we had in effect seen a lowering of the deficit by a little under $100 billion for the previous year. The result, at least in large part, of economic growth interacting with the tax code to produce additional revenues. To me, that points the way for at least partially digging out from under this problem, even though we now have huge additional obligations, as some of the other members have noted. To me, through all of this, you've made the case for strong policies to continue to encourage economic growth. And I'm concerned that we have, in effect, in the tax code, scheduled under current law a tax increase in a couple of the provisions that directly impact on our growth rate. And here I'm noting for the record that in 2008, under current law, the capital gains tax rate will go back up, and the reforms in dividends will be phased out. And I wonder if you would comment on whether you think that is sound policy, or whether Congress should move now while we have the opportunity to make the current rates permanent before the market begins to anticipate that we might allow those tax increases to go into law. Do you share my concern, Mr. Chairman?
I think there are two issues here, Congressman, and I thank you, incidentally, for your kind remarks. The first is I've testified previously. I do think that the partial elimination of the double taxation of dividends has been a major contribution to the structure of our tax system, and I should very much like to see it continued. Secondly, however, I'd like to see it continued in the context of PAYGO, in the sense that we should not be cutting taxes by borrowing. We should be cutting taxes by reducing the level of spending. And that's an issue which I think is critically on the table. We do not have the capability of having both productive tax cuts and large expenditure increases and presume that the deficit doesn't matter, because it will create very serious backlashes in the system. So I would like to see the extension of that provision in the tax law, but I would insist that it be done in the context of a pay-go, which is not currently on the books. And I would think that, as I indicated in my testimony, one of the very first things that we ought to be doing is recognizing that if we're going to come to grips with the very difficult budget problems that exist as the baby boomers start to retire, we have got to put in place a structure which will enable the Congress to make rational choices, which I don't believe is realistically possible unless you have something like the Budget Enforcement Act of 1990 on the books. And if that is the case, then I would say let's confront the question of the trade-offs of what the advantages are of keeping or even increasing the reduction of the double taxation on dividends with the context of what other priorities there are. There are no easy choices. The easy choices are long gone. The question of these choices are between things which a majority of the Congress has previously said is good, and another one which a majority of Congress has said is good, but both can't exist at the same time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. English. Ms. Sanchez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Greenspan, for your service to our country. I think most of my colleagues have already spoken about your service, and I would associate myself with their words. I have a couple of questions. One has to do with the capital markets and our budget situation here in Washington, D.C., and the other has to do with something that was in your testimony on page 5 with respect to the result of 100 million educated workers from the former Soviet bloc entering into the world's trading system, China's $750 million people workforce, and India also engaging in. Let me go first with this one, because basically what you've said in here is the world's economy has been able to absorb much of this workforce. And you've also said in there, or you alluded to the fact that they're educated workers. And my biggest fear for this country's future, competitively speaking, is that we're doing such a poor job in education. When I go to the universities, the teachers in the graduate departments of science and math tend to be foreigners, and probably 3/4 of the classes are. So I guess my question to you is, with this disparity that we continue to see growing between no growth or actually a decrease in the real income of unskilled workers in the United States versus the high-skilled workers, what do you think we should do as a nation to address that?
Let me address the issue broadly, because I think this is a critical question that we'll be confronted with as the years go on. The global world is changing in a way which is that an ever higher proportion of value added in the world of goods and services produced, meaning value which the world consumers view as value, is becoming increasingly conceptual and less physical, more services and less physical goods. We have recently done an analysis which indicates that there's a very high correlation amongst we did 136 countries in the world, between the proportion of services to GDP and the relative real per capita income in that country, in a sense reflecting the fact that those countries with an above average amount of services relative to goods being produced tend to have the higher standard of living. And what we are in the United States going through is a very difficult transition, where our standard of living continues to increase, our per capita real GDP continues to be increasing. Amongst the major countries, we are obviously well ahead, even considering the problem I was discussing with Congressman Hinchy previously. But on average, we are well ahead, which essentially says that we're going through a period which is extremely stressful for those people who are producing goods. And indeed, we've had an extraordinary decline, not in industrial production, which is held up, but in the productivity that is involved in industrial production, in which the job loss has been horrendous. And in certain areas of the country, it's really been a very serious and stressful problem. It does say to us, however, that our standard of living is dependent on our ability to create services, conceptual services, ever more as an increasing ratio to goods. And this is where our educational system is going to be critical. And while I do think we will find that both in China and in India that there is a huge number of educated people, they still are missing one thing which we have, which in addition to our fairly wide, but as I said previously, less than numerous skilled workers, we've got a really very imaginative workforce and a very productive workforce. We also have got what the others don't have, namely the Constitution of the United States. What that has done, in my judgment, is to create a rule of law which enables individuals both in this country and investing from abroad. In other words, those invest in the United States and they know and they trust the courts of this country to protect their rights. And that is true both of citizens of the United States and foreigners. And I believe that has been a very major factor in why we do as well as we do. And indeed, a lot of the so-called development research, which endeavors to determine why certain economies prosper and others don't, would subscribe to that. But unless we can get our educational system in check, even our Constitution is not likely to protect us over the very long run. But we do have an awful lot going for us, and I think if we can resolve our educational problems, I think we will maintain the very extraordinary position the United States holds in the world at large.
I see my time has expired, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sanchez. Mr. Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing. And Mr. Chairman, like others, I want to thank you for your service. It's been famously said, you make a living by what you get, you make a life by what you give. You have given back so much to your guidance of our economy and the Fed to the prosperity of this nation. I just want to join others in thanking you for your leadership. I want to ask two questions related, one to foreign holdings of U.S. debt and the other to the account deficit the U.S. is running. In your view, what do you see as the real-world risk to the large amount of foreign holdings of our U.S. debt? And in the account deficit, you know, while we mostly look at that as a function of what we purchase and what we export, there's a savings component in that trade deficit that I think is often ignored. Can you give your views to us on what impact we can have, what role that plays in long term for us?
I think as part of the globalization process, which has been accelerating over recent years, especially since 1995. In other words, the last decade has been a remarkable period of expanding trade, movement of capital, and all of the various measures which we use to say globalization has increased. What this has also meant is that whereas you can compare, for example, the U.S. economy 150 years ago, where we had a lot of interstate movement of goods and services, and trade deficits between the states, but very little outside of our borders. As we expanded into a national market, all of that activity that is going on between peoples in different geographical areas, which creates deficits and creates debt and all the variety of other elements, spills over our sovereign borders, and now we look at it in a somewhat different way, but it really is not. I mean, I grant you that there is exchange rate risk and legal risk with respect to the question of whose jurisdiction you're in, but a lot of what we are observing is economic process, which is adjusted. The markets are gradually adjusting. The big puzzle to everybody is how is it possible for the United States to have financed more than 6%, to have a current account deficit of more than 6% of the GDP. It's one of the major puzzles, and the reason why I believe it exists is that it's a market phenomenon which is reflecting globalization. It can't go on indefinitely, as I've indicated previously, but a lot of these variables, that is, the big increase in debt holdings or U.S. Treasury holdings by foreign central banks, or the even larger holdings of American debt by foreign citizens. All of this is a buildup which is characteristic of the global markets. At some point, the globalization will slow down. But we're in a period where it's been undergoing extraordinary expansion and has had effects we have yet to fully understand. Indeed, one of the problems that we have run into, which was a great surprise to us, is how apparently the globalization forces have what we would have expected in June of 2004, when we started our tightening of monetary policy, would impact on longer-term rates. It didn't, and it didn't because of these extraordinary forces, which we're just now beginning to understand. And so, yes, we ought to be looking at these various different increases. I mean, a very significant part of our federal debt is held outside of this country. In fact, it's close to half, depending on what the denominator is. But that is part and parcel of the globalization process, and I think the presumption that when it stops, the whole world is going to collapse, I do not think is correct, unless we fall back on a degree of protectionism which has not existed in the world in the post-World War II period.
Thank you. Would your advice to Congress be to not overreact to those elements until we see further how it is working out and what the impact is in this?
Yes, most certainly, Congressman, and indeed I've argued in other recent testimony that the best way we can address this type of problem is to make certain that our economy overall is sufficiently flexible so the adverse events, the unforecastable events that occur as part of this globalization will not have a significant negative impact on production or employment in this country. That, as far as policy is concerned, that is a policy issue, and I think we ought to move as best we can to create as much flexibility as we can in our system.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, let me just ask a quick question here. When we've talked about various stimuli that have occurred in recent years, and one of the byproducts of the easing of monetary policy, which began in 2001, was to give homeowners whose properties had increased in value the opportunity to refinance at lower rates of interest. And as people did that, we found them not only refinancing to the balance of their higher rate mortgage, but also taking out more of their equity, which supported consumer spending. I'm just curious to know whether the Fed anticipated that this would happen, and your thoughts on just generally on this matter.
Well, in the early stages, we didn't, largely because the proportion of cash outs that were associated with refinancing were relatively small. But as refinancing became ever easier, as the costs of refinancing declined, and as indeed home equity loans became a major instrument for household debt accumulation, or more exactly, an ability to extract equity from homes, plus the automatic extraction of equity that occurs when homes are sold and the realized capital gains for all practical purposes come out as cash. These have turned out to be extraordinarily large amounts relative to disposable income. And 10 years ago, we would not have been able to forecast them because we would not have been able to foresee the extraordinary changes that would emerge in the mortgage markets, in the secondary mortgage market, in the whole structure of asset-backed securities more generally, and the willingness on the part of households and their ability, obviously, to extract very substantial amounts of equity as the capital gains built up. We have been observing that phenomenon very closely. Indeed, one of my colleagues at the Fed and I have put together a fairly detailed series trying to trace the issue of cash outs and the effects of equity extraction from home turnover and home equity loans, and trying to determine to what extent that has been a factor in the decline in the savings rate in this country. We're still examining it. There are conflicts in the data, but I mean, it's very clear that a good part of the decline in the savings rate is directly attributable to the extraction of equity.
Mr. Chairman, one of my great staffers and I have had ongoing conversations about the so-called flattening of the yield curve, which essentially means that short-term rates have gone up while long-term rates have come down and stabilized, creating a very small gap between short-term and long-term rates. What, in your opinion, is the effect of this on the economy in the future?
Mr. Chairman, that used to be one of the, I guess, most accurate measures we used to have to indicate when a recession was about to occur and when a recovery was about to occur. It's lost its capability of doing so in recent years. The markets have become far more complex, and the simple relationships that yield curve slope indicated no longer worked. I mean, for example, remember we used to have Reg Q a number of years ago, which essentially limited the extent to which you could increase interest rates, short-term deposit rates. And that created all sorts of imbalances in the system, and was an indicator which induced a change in the structure of the yield curves, which did anticipate fairly accurately what was going to happen to financial markets and to the economy. The effectiveness of that relationship to where the economy is going has virtually disappeared. And while it has significant financial impacts, it's no longer useful as a leading indicator to the extent that it was.
I thank you for that. I just want to refer to the chart that we put up. The red line, of course, refers to short-term rates, which have gone up 12 times. The darker gray line, I guess it is, indicates the level of long-term rates. And I guess my question is, if banks are paying, if banks are forced to pay interest at the relatively high rate on short-term loans, and what is the encouragement to loan with long-term rates when there's such a small difference in the spread?
Well, what's happening is that for example, in the mortgage market, where we used to find that when rates were low, say back closer to June 2004, adjustable rate mortgages became an extraordinarily important instrument. They are obviously undergoing significant contraction now as the rates go up, and indeed the escalation goes up, even though a very substantial number of those loans are so-called hybrids. They're half short-term, half long-term mortgages. But consumers are changing their behavior. And we would have clearly expected that to happen, and we don't think that's bad. We think that's good.
Thank you. Ms. Maloney.
Thank you, Mr. Greenspan. When you say that inflation causes recession, are you saying that the private economy on its own collapses, or are you saying that inflation leads to a monetary policy response, higher interest rates, that slows the economic activity?
I think the problem is that it's the inflation process itself that creates the difficulty, and to the extent that monetary policy is inappropriate, central bank could contribute to that, or it can actually reduce the probability. But there are broader inflationary processes in the private economy as well, so it's a combination of a number of forces.
What caused the 1981 recession?
Essentially, a recognition on the part of government generally that the acceleration of inflation that was building all through the latter part of the 1970s was creating such huge distortions that unless and until we confronted it, this country could get into very serious trouble. As a consequence, my predecessor in October 1979 withdrew a huge amount of liquidity from the system in order to bring down the inflation rate. That process, while it ultimately was clearly successful and terribly importantly successful to the economy longer term, had short-term consequences, which was a very severe recession. I would, in a sense, debit the recession to the earlier policies that created the inflationary pressures which necessitated the reaction that we had, rather than to the Federal Reserve's action in 1979. We had no choice, and indeed, had that action not been implemented, I fear for the stability of our system, therefore, forward.
You have spoken very eloquently today about the growing, and expressed concern about the growing gap between the haves and the have-nots, the inequality that is growing in our country, which is a very bad trend. And the solutions that you've talked about are all long-term. I want to pick up on one of the points that you made about the effects of integrating China and India into the world economy. And you described that as helping to keep labor costs contained and helpful in restraining inflation. But doesn't it also contribute to inequality by putting a downward pressure on the wages of U.S. workers and the competition that they feel internationally?
Yeah, it hasn't put downward pressure overall. What it has done is tended to put downward pressure mainly in the goods area of the American economy because that is where their capabilities at this particular stage of their development are most evident. And the impact has been fairly pronounced in a number of areas of this country, especially in the manufacturing area.
And I'd like to bring up a point that Dr. Alan Blinder brought up at a Democratic forum we had on the economy. And he argued that continuing advances in telecommunications technology are going to make global outsourcing of jobs a much larger problem in the future. He says we have a challenge now, but in the future it is going to be absolutely huge. And that it's in the coming years that the highly skilled, educated workers could be just as vulnerable as the less skilled workers. And doesn't that imply that education and training are at the least a very incomplete answer to the challenge that we confront with the outsourcing of jobs and the growing middle-class job insecurity that I hear every day in my office?
As globalization proceeds and very clearly creates an average higher level of standard of living in this country, it also, because it rests upon what we call creative destruction, induces a greater degree of insecurity in the system as manifested by the fact that today 500,000 people lose their jobs every week and another 500,000 quit, and we hire 1 million people, or plus or minus, every week. The churning is extraordinary. It basically means that the old view of job security, which we tended to have, or the way we viewed what it was in earlier generations, is disappearing. We're now finding that education is not it's not wholly constrained to our earlier years. It is basically becoming a lifelong proposition. Community colleges, for example, are becoming a major part of our education system, and the average age of the people in community colleges is quite high. So people are continuing to recognize that they're going to have more than one job. Indeed, they may well have more than one profession. This is the choice that we must make. In other words, if we want the benefits of the huge amount of interaction, division of labor, and specialization that is implicit in an ever-growing world economy, and that implies a huge amount of outsourcing of all goods, both insourcing and outsourcing. We, at the moment, of course, are the recipient of more outsourcing than we give out. We have a net surplus of services. I don't know whether that will continue to exist or not, but I do agree that the amount of exchange of services across national borders are almost surely going to increase. And as a consequence of that, standards of living will increase. But in the process, there are winners and there are losers. And if you have creative destruction, which essentially means you move the obsolescent capital, less productive capital, to cutting-edge technologies, it necessarily means that the workforce which is involved in the growingly obsolescent technology has got to move to another part of the economy. And that's happening. It's happening in the vast, vast majority of cases. But there is a small and very pronounced segment of the world economy which is creating problems which are difficult to reverse.
My time is up. Thank you very much.
Mr. Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned earlier that we've been debating the monetary issue for a long time, and I guess that will go on. I'm quite confident that what I say here or whatever we say together probably won't determine whether paper wins over gold or vice versa, because I think the market will determine that. I think the only thing that I have on my side is history, because paper currencies don't have a very good history. They usually end up in the waste can, and gold survives the many thousands of years that it has been used, so time will tell. But a question I have relating to gold is currently, especially since the early 80s, 25 years, the last time there was ever any serious talk about gold. Today it's inappropriate to talk about it. But since that time, you know, of course, the dollar has lost a lot of value. But during that time, essentially, the paper has won out, intellectually speaking. Nobody speaks of gold. But the question I have is, why does our government, why does policy still mean that we should hold the gold? I would, and I don't have any problems with this. I would think that if we trust paper, we ought to just get rid of the gold and spend the money. We're in big deficits. We could get a lot of money for it. So why, if gold is so out of place and we'll never have to use it again, why couldn't we make the case for just getting rid of it, as well as the IMF?
Mr. Chairman, before you answer, if I may just ask my colleagues, Mr. Hinchey and I think Ms. Sanchez also have a question. We're in the beginning of a series of votes, so if we could get through this question rather expeditiously and go to Mr. Hinchey and then Ms. Sanchez, and then we'll go vote, and we won't have to ask you to wait for us to come back from this series. So go ahead and respond to this question, if you would.
It's a question, what do we do with the gold supply?
Why don't, if we don't believe in gold, why don't we just get rid of it?
It's a very interesting question, and it's a question that has been debated at length on rare occasions within government. The bottom line is that in periods of extreme chaos, it's turned out that gold has been the ultimate means by which transactions have been consummated. It occurred, for example, during World War II, that you could only negotiate transactions with gold. I must say to you, however, there was a vigorous debate in the Ford administration as to whether or not it made any sense to hold gold stock at all, and the debate ended up with leaving it as it is. I would suspect the same psychology exists around the world, and that's the reason why the IMF basically holds the gold that it does, but it's also the reason that other central banks are holding the gold that they do. You might be aware, for example, that the Europeans have sold off significant amounts of their gold, but they still hold quite a good deal.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. Mr. Hinchey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in response to one of the questions that I was asking earlier with regard to this growing inequality in income, you were drawing attention to the inequality between supervisory personnel and non-supervisory personnel. Now, I understand that, and that's fine, but that isn't the real issue. The real issue is the huge growing inequality between people at the top of the income ladders and those down at the middle. As I pointed out, even a very conservative scholar at the very conservative American Enterprise Institute pointed out that the benefits of the tax cuts are going to capital and not to workers. That's a problem that we face. Now, you, of course, looking at these growing surpluses back in the beginning of this decade, were very supportive of the ideological tax cuts that came out of this administration, which were designed to benefit people at the upper income of the ladder. Now, at the same time, this country, for several decades now, has been facing some very serious infrastructure deterioration, everything from energy to transportation to environmental protection, health care, general quality of life, all of that has been declining for decades in the public sector. Wouldn't it have been wiser to take some of that money in those surpluses, rather than just give almost all of it to the wealthiest people in the country, to use some of it to build up the basic infrastructure of the country, rather than continuing to witness this serious deterioration? And the final aspect of my question is, we have another tax cut coming up next year, '06. That tax cut comes about at a time when the median income is just over $44,000, meaning half of the people in the country make less than that. This tax cut is going to benefit people making over $182,000 and couples making more than $326,000. Aren't we on the wrong track here, Mr. Chairman?
Well, Congressman, I think that a large number of economists, and perhaps most, view the issue of tax policy in two ways. One, how does it impact on the growth of the economy and the increase in the tax base that is associated with the growth? And in my arguments in favor of a number of the tax cuts which have been offered in recent years, especially the one which I thought was the most structurally desirable, namely the elimination of the double taxation of dividends for lots of reasons, is essentially, I recommended it essentially because I believed it would enhance economic growth. Similarly, I was a strong supporter of the 1986 Tax Act, which, as you know, eliminated all the loopholes, reduced the base, and improved the system materially. There are two schools with respect to taxation. One is, what does it do to the economy and to the tax base? And two, what does it do to the distribution of income? I think in considering the issue, you have to look at both. And I think that there's a tendency for one side of this aisle to look one way and the other side to look at the other. And I think that perhaps we ought to be aware that there's double entry bookkeeping involved here as in many other things.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Sanchez.
Well, that's not an answer, Mr. Chairman, but I thank you very much for it, and I wish you the very best in the future.
Thank you very much, Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, before I came to the Congress, I was involved in the capital markets, and so I have a question for you, just an overall question that's been bothering me for a while, and I ask my friends on Wall Street, and really most of the time they just shrug their shoulders and don't have a good answer for this. So maybe I thought as a parting, since this will be the last time you're before our committee, maybe you could give me some advice on this. I'm worried that we have an $8 trillion debt. And from my calculation, even though you brought up today that you thought the unified budget was about a deficit of $319 billion right now, I sometimes, when I look at it, truly look at it, I look at us spending between $400 and $800 billion more every year, at least in the last 5 years of this Congress. Because I think there's, and I believe there's a lot of things that don't get taken into account, supplementals that we do here, supplemental appropriation bills. We have the 2 Louisiana senators asking for $250 billion just for Louisiana. We have a Medicare Part D package that was supposed to be $400 billion, spending over 10 years. Now is calculated at least $1.3 trillion. Probably will get to $2 trillion by the time we finish with that. We spend $1.5 billion a week in Iraq with no end in sight in that place, and that doesn't include the reinvestment we're going to need to do in our vehicles and all of our everything that's wasting away in that desert right now. I have a Congress, a lot of colleagues who want to increase our Army by 100,000 new troops and don't really know what the cost is to that or the capacity that we currently have and how that's going to affect our troops. So we have all these big spending plans out there. My question is, why haven't the capital markets told Congress in Washington, D.C. to get their act together? Why are they ignoring what is happening here?
That is an excellent question, Congresswoman, and let me explain to you what I think the answer is, but I don't know for certain. As part of this globalization trend, not only have we had the major disinflationary forces that are occurring because of the educated workers of the former Soviet Union, China, and India coming in, but we also have had the issue of, as I think I testified before the House Banking Committee, an excess of saving over investment and a general set of forces suppressing long-term interest rates. So the question really is, why is it that with what is got to be a rising expectations of very heavy borrowing as we move out, say, into the early part of the next decade, why isn't that beginning to reflect itself in, say, 10-year notes? Because it's got to be out there for 10 years. And I think the answer is, and I don't really fully feel comfortable with it, it's one of the issues which I think is on the table and has to be understood, is that the disinflationary pressures, the excess savings pressures have more than offset the expectational concerns that rising supplies of U.S. Treasury debt have out there. I think that's going to change. I think that, as I try to indicate in my prepared remarks, this is a gradually changing process, but I find it utterly inconceivable, frankly, that we can have the type of potential fiscal outlook which now confronts us over the next 15, 20 years, which, unless addressed, will not have a significant impact on long-term interest rates. So I guess the answer to your question is there are other forces involved offsetting it, or, put it another way, that the impact has been delayed.
Mr. Chairman, just let me add to the chorus of thank yous for the many appearances that you've made here before the Joint Economic Committee over the years. We have benefited greatly from your wisdom, and we thank you for all of that, and want you to know that we have appreciated it very much. And in conclusion, I guess I would just like to say best of everything in the future. Thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the committee. I've always enjoyed being here, and I must say I get questions at this committee which I don't hear elsewhere, and they're most interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Alan Greenspan retires as Federal Reserve Chairman on January 31st. The President's nominee to succeed him, Ben Bernanke, begins confirmation hearings at a date to be determined by the Senate Budget Committee.